2 weeks ago, we began looking at evidence for Christianity. And we looked at evidence for God's existence, and I gave you 3 arguments to that effect. And then last week, we started getting our feet wet looking at the evidence, first of all, for mere Christianity. And I was able to make a case for the resurrection of Jesus simply using those facts that scholars generally grant as true. So even scholars that think that the New Testament is largely unreliable will grant certain facts about Jesus, like the fact that he existed, the facts of the empty tomb and the post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' faith in the resurrection. And you can use these facts, there are about 10 of them, to make a solid case for the resurrection of Jesus, which is an amazing thought that we can actually defend our faith, mere Christianity at least, just utilizing those mere or basic facts. But of course, if all you had were the minimal facts about Jesus, we wouldn't really get very far in knowing a whole lot about him as a person in history. And so this past Saturday, yesterday, we began looking at the evidence for the reliability of the New Testament. We actually started that journey last week when we established the fact that we actually currently possess right now the very New Testament that was written in the first century. So this Greek New Testament that I have in my hand, I can be absolutely confident that we actually have what was written. What I'm not 100% confident of is the decisions that text critics have made with regard to what the original reading was. But that original reading is nevertheless found either in the footnotes or in the text proper. Yesterday, we started looking at the genre of the Gospels and the authorship of those Gospels. Now, what does genre refer to? Genre refers to the type of literature we're dealing with. Are the Gospels meant to be mythic, or are they meant to be biographies of a man who really lived? And the standard opinion today, the conventional wisdom today, mainly through the work of Richard Burridge and others, is that the Gospels really are biographies, Greco-Roman biographies in particular. And this is really important because Christ's mythicism is built on several pillars. For example, the idea that the statements about Jesus outside the New Testament are not trustworthy, or that Paul never refers to an historical Jesus, or as one critic says, Paul never wrote any of the letters that are ascribed to him in the New Testament. The idea that the gospel writers borrowed from pagan literature to create a mythic character. And finally, the idea that the Gospels are of the mythic genre. Now, in order for Christ's mythicism to work, for it to be true, all 4 of those pillars have to be true. And we've actually drawn into doubt 3 of those pillars. We've shown that the statements about Jesus outside the New Testament are trustworthy and tell us about a real man who really lived. We've shown that Paul wrote at least 4 letters ascribed to him. And yesterday we established that the 4 Gospels were all written by the traditional authors whom the church has always said wrote them. Matthew and John are actual apostles of Christ. They were eyewitnesses to the life of Jesus. And Mark and Luke, though not eyewitnesses, at least according to most scholars, they nevertheless knew or were closely associated with apostles. So Matthew, a tax collector, wrote the first gospel. I'm going to give you a very, what I might call a complex thesis, in the sense that I think Matthew went through several editions before the final edition came out. Mark was a student of Peter and basically transcribed Peter's sermons about the life of Jesus. Luke was a student of Paul. And then, of course, John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, wrote the last gospel. For the most part, I think that most of this material was written down in the order as we find them in the canonical Gospels. There are a few hiccups there that we'll get to, but I think Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John does represent largely the order in which they were written. Now, we went through a lot of information yesterday showing all of this. And so when the videos come out, I want to encourage those of you that weren't here yesterday to watch those. But we do have an objection. And here's the objection. The Gospels nowhere identify their authors, and so we cannot know who wrote them. In fact, I showed a video clip yesterday of Tovia Singer, who is the greatest living Jewish critic of Christianity. And he said, quite infamously, I guess you could say, whoever thinks they know who wrote Mark, just they don't know what they're talking about. And one of the points that Singer makes in that video is, well, they never identify themselves as the author. So the theory goes that they were originally anonymous and they were passed around. Now, we looked at that in some detail, but what do I say to someone who says, well, why wouldn't the gospel writers just identify themselves in the book? Why wouldn't Mark say in verse 1, by the way, I, Mark, write this? I will say, as an aside, I don't think that the critics of Christianity would buy it anyway. So I don't know what good it would do. I mean, Paul identifies himself in 13 letters, and most critics only accept 7. So I don't know if identifying himself would make much of a difference. But here's my short answer to this. Given the sociocultural context in which the 4 Gospels were written, we should not expect Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John to identify themselves. Multiple famous works written between 100 BC and AD 200 lack self-identification by the author, and yet external sources within the tradition give us the identity of these authors. And so I've given you a chart here, and I know one of you loves the classics, and so he can maybe come up and verify this, or at least afterwards, verify this for me. He and I had dinner the other night. You know who you are, and we talked about this. But here's some examples of classical writers who wrote, and I give the chart as to whether they identify themselves as the writer of this work. So notice that Julius Caesar wrote his commentary on the Gallic Wars. He didn't identify himself in the Gallic Wars. Well, how do we know that Caesar wrote the Gallic Wars? We have ancient traditions, among other Latin works, that identify Caesar as the author. Or Sallust, well, he does identify himself in his work. Livy, on his History of Rome, he doesn't identify himself. He discusses the goals in the preface, but does not name himself. The authorship of the work is confirmed externally. And we could go on with this. Paterculus does identify himself. Josephus does identify himself, but Plutarch does not identify himself. Tacitus does not identify himself. Suetonius does not identify himself, but Appian of Alexandria does identify himself. And what am I trying to communicate to you? Arian does identify himself. Cassius Dio does identify himself. So there's a mix. Some of these ancient classical writers identified themselves as the author. Some did not. What is our response to this in terms of why we would accept an ancient work as having been written by the people that are generally known to have written these works? Those who held the documents in custody are the ones that have the right to tell us who wrote these documents. As any lawyer will tell you, evidence is held in a chain of custody. And as long as you have that chain of custody established, we can know, even if it is an external source, who wrote the text. Now, who holds the Gospels in the chain of custody? The church. And as I told you before, the Gospels, or the New Testament, is the church's book. And as such, the church identifies who these writers are. We gave external evidence for this, but we also gave internal evidence. And so because the church has held these documents in its chain of custody since their inception, we can trust that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote these books. Okay. Yes. Yes. And so let me repeat the question. The question was, would Mark, for example, not identify himself out of some fear of persecution? And I don't think that that would be the motivation for it, but I do think that they have an extra incentive not to identify themselves because they want to elevate the name of Christ. So having established who these writers are, we've actually begun the process of showing that these are, in fact, historically reliable documents. If eyewitnesses wrote the text, or those closely associated with eyewitnesses wrote the text, then we already have an incentive to think that what they are saying is believable, if not totally true. And so what we do in part 3 here is we're going to look at the case for the historical reliability of these documents. And I'm going to say, first of all, the works have been multiply verified by archaeological discoveries. And I'm also going to make the case that the Gospels and Acts were written early in Christian history. And that means that multiple people could verify their statements. So I'm going to go from the outside in. First, what does archaeology have to say about this? And then what might we say about the dating of these works? Now, you'll notice that I have been assuming up to this point that these works were written very late. I'm just following the critics or the skeptics. I'm saying Mark was written around the year 75, Matthew 85, Luke 95, John 110. These are extremely late dates. I'm just granting for the sake of discussion. But what might we say in favor of the earlier dates? Let's start with where the critics start. We have Mark written in 75, Matthew 85, Luke 95. Now, yesterday we did hear Tovia Singer say that Matthew and Mark were written around the same time. So Tovia Singer would probably put Luke in the year 85, about the same time that Matthew was written. Why would a critic do that? I want one of my students to answer that. Why, my credit students, why would a critic want Matthew and Luke to be written around the same time? Yes. Actually, no, they don't. He doesn't think that Luke and Matthew knew each other. Okay. So remember, the skeptic doesn't think that the tradition is right. So Luke did not write Luke, Matthew did not write Matthew. So they did not collude at all. They had to be written about the same time, precisely because Matthew wrote independently of Luke and Luke wrote independently of Matthew. Now, why would they insist that Matthew and Luke wrote independently of each other? Okay, so the point was they would be accused of writing the same story, that collaboration. Okay. Okay, so if you wrote something and your friend wrote something, you would give more credence to what they wrote. Now, what you're giving is actually a reason why we Christians should actually believe these texts in one sense. But the critics think that the texts are so contradictory. The birth narratives, for example, which we'll be studying in some detail in the next couple of weeks, are so contradictory that there's no way that they colluded together to write this. They wrote independently of one another, and their sources are independent of one another. So that's why the critics argue that they were written about the same time. If you have Luke being written in 95 and Matthew in 85, that's a 10-year window, and that increases the probability that Luke would have known of Matthew, in which case he would not have written the story the way he wrote it, lest he contradict Matthew. Or you might have a critic that says, well, maybe Luke just didn't care. I too have the Spirit, and so I can write any story I want. But there's very little chance that Luke or Matthew, whoever wrote these, whether Luke and Matthew wrote them or Fred and Jack, and we just named them Luke and Matthew, it doesn't matter who wrote these. There's very little chance that they originated these stories. And as I pointed out yesterday, even on the critics' terms, these birth stories pass a criterion called multiple independent attestation. The source behind Luke and the source behind Matthew were independent of each other. And therefore, we actually have really good reason to think that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Now, Q. This is another source. This is from the German word Quell, which means source. And this is the material that Luke and Matthew use that you don't find in Mark. So you have Mark and Q influencing or serving as sources for Matthew, and Mark and Q serving as the sources for Luke. And Luke depended on what is also called L material. That's the material he didn't get from Matthew, that he didn't get from Mark or Q. Matthew has material called M, and that's the material he didn't get from Q or Mark. This is how the critics generally read the story in terms of how these texts were produced. Now, I'm going to draw a lot of this into doubt, but this is just reminding all of you of how these gospels were put together according to the critics. And one of the things that I'm trying to impress upon all of you as well is that just as you can use the criterion of multiple independent attestation to show that certain events happen, even on the critics' terms, you can actually make the case for mere Christianity, even on this model. One of the reasons I've approached this material the way I have, I've started with what the critics are saying, and then I'm narrowing down, and I'm going to give you my views on this today. But I'm starting here because I don't want the case for mere Christianity to be built on some idiosyncratic reading of the data. Travis Campbell reads it this way, and therefore it's that way. No, I'm using the critics' facts to make my case for the resurrection of Jesus, for example. Or in this case, regarding the birth, I'm using the critics' own criteria and their own presuppositions to show that Jesus was indeed born in Bethlehem. Follow Paul's example. Be all things to all people. You're not going to be able to, when you're in a witnessing encounter, establish all of your assumptions in a conversation. So start with where they are and show that the gospel is true on their own terms. It's a wonderful skill to develop, especially in conversations about the gospel. Okay. I'm going to argue that Q is actually what I call proto-Matthew. In fact, some of you may remember this, even in your own reading of this. The credit students will definitely remember this because yesterday we looked at multiple fathers who spoke of Matthew delivering to us a sayings gospel. For the critic, Q is really just a list of Jesus' sayings. Q doesn't have any narrative to it, no biography. Well, I actually tend to think that Matthew, when he was studying under Jesus, wrote down many of the sayings of Jesus. And so, we've never found the document called Q. But strangely enough, the Catholic tradition, the broader Christian tradition, the universal church, that tradition gives us some reason to think that there's something like a Q document that was produced. Namely, Papias tells us that Matthew gave us the sayings of the Lord. Okay, so we will move on from there. So here's an objection. The Gospels and Acts were written decades. Have y'all ever heard this before? They were written decades after Jesus died, so that gives us a lot of time for this true story to be lost. How many of you have heard something like that yeah, there we go. Here's my answer. By ancient standards, when we look at the time between the life of an individual and the records we have of that life, the Gospels are more reliable than most of the works coming out of the ancient world. For many works were not written merely decades after the person died, but centuries. And so, to give you another chart, Sallust is pretty good. The time gap between his writing and when the events actually happened is 20 years. Julius Caesar, really good, contemporary. Livy, some of the material he's working with, he's talking about things that happened 700 years before he wrote. Paterculus, 750 years before he wrote. Josephus is contemporary with some of what he's writing, and in other cases, he's 2,000 years after the event. Plutarch, 106 to 600 years. Plutarch gave us one of the early biographies of Alexander the Great. Our earliest biography of Alexander the Great is 200 years after Alexander the Great died. Tacitus, 10 to 80 years. He's considered the greatest of the Roman historians. Suetonius, 20 to 160 years. Appian, 100 to 600 years. Arian, 400 to 450 years. Cassius Dio, 100 years up to 1,000 years. And then my favorite, the Buddhist sutras were not written down until 500 to 600 years after Buddha died. And I told you last week about the text critical issues. Our best texts of the sutras, the Pali Canon, are from the 18th century. That is a long time. So the Gospels look really good. We have traditions going back to within 5 years of Jesus' death, even if you reject the early dates for the Gospels, as I explained from Paul. And if the Gospels were written as early as I'm claiming, then we actually have people in real time recording the words of Jesus. And within just a few years constructing a passion narrative and constructing other stories about Jesus and putting them down in writing. Okay, here's some archaeological confirmation. The book that all of you should get, it should just be in your library, even if you never read it. Okay, this is one of those books, is the Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History by Colin Hemer. Now, there is another work on Acts that I'd like to tell you about. I don't have it on screen or anything, but it's by Craig Keener. It is a 4-volume commentary on the Book of Acts. Okay. Who has like a big study Bible? Hold it up. Somebody. Okay, hold up your thick study Bible. Okay. Okay. Keener's commentary is, volume 1 is twice as big as that, and it's 4 volumes of that. Okay? And he just combs through the Book of Acts. So Keener and Colin Hemer, I'm not necessarily recommending that you get Keener's commentary on Acts. I just want you to know it does in fact exist. And he goes very carefully through the Book of Acts, verse by verse, pericope by pericope, and shows its plausibility historically and even at times where it's been verified archaeologically. Colin Hemer is carrying on really the tradition established by William Ramsay. Who is William Ramsay? William Ramsay was a German scholar, got educated in Tübingen. Actually, I take that back. I'm not sure if he was in fact German, but I know he was educated at Tübingen. And Ramsay was a critic. He went and started doing archaeological research in the Middle East, and he found himself over and over and over again having to consult the Book of Acts to help him understand what he's discovering. And he finally came to the conclusion that Luke, who wrote Acts, was an historian of the first rank. Colin Hemer, who died just before this book was published, so this book was technically published posthumously after his death, basically confirms Ramsay's conclusions. So Ramsay's conclusions stand because of what Colin Hemer did in this work. So, just to give you some examples, in the Book of Acts, we have the accurate naming of Roman officials, the verification. The Delphi inscription confirms Lucius Junius Gallio as the proconsul of Achaia, which aligns with Acts 18:12. Incidentally, Acts 18:12 intersects with other things that we know about history. Suetonius tells us that Claudius expelled all the Jews from Rome. And Acts 18:2 tells us that same thing. And so we actually know when Paul planted the church in Corinth. He planted the church in Corinth around the year 49 because it intersects with this archaeological confirmation as well as the literary confirmation we find in Suetonius. There are correct political titles, for example, politarchs in Thessalonica. Inscriptions in Thessalonica refer to city officials as politarchs, matching the term used in Acts 17:6. Moving forward, precise geographical details, travel routes and city locations, verification. Archaeological findings corroborate the locations and travel routes described in Acts, such as the journey from Troas to Neapolis. That is recorded for us in Acts 16:11. Sailing and navigation practices in the Mediterranean. The verification, the descriptions of sea voyages in Acts, including the detailed account of the shipwreck in Acts 27, align with known ancient maritime practices. References to local customs and legal proceedings. Verification Acts accurately portrays local customs and legal practices, such as the Ephesian riot and the role of the town clerk in Acts 1935. Confirmation of religious practices and cults in Asia Minor. Verification, the account of the Artemis cult in Ephesus, that is in 1923 through 41, is supported by archaeological evidence of the Temple of Artemis and related artifacts. Philippi, identified as a Roman colony. Verification, historical records, and excavations confirm Philippi's status as a Roman colony during the time of Paul's visit. That is in Acts 16:12. Some of you are like, good gosh, there's a lot. Yeah. And I'm not being exhaustive here. I'm just giving you a taste. Ephesus Theater and the Artemis cult, the Grand Theater of Ephesus mentioned in Acts 19:29, has been excavated and matches the biblical description. The depiction of Athenian customs and Stoic Epicurean philosophies in Acts 17. The verification is that this text in 17:18 through 21 accurately reflects Athenian philosophical debates and the practice of discussing new ideas at the Areopagus. It is very interesting to me, and I always have to make this point whenever I touch Acts 17, that Paul will actually give a speech on Mars Hill. And who is he addressing? He's addressing the Epicureans. Well, who are they? Well, these were atheists. They were atheists living at the time. And who were the Stoics? Well, they were pantheists. I find it so interesting that life has not changed. What are the main worldviews facing Christianity today? Secular humanism and what we used to call the New Age movement, the idea that we're all one with God and God is everything. That's, just things have not changed. It's theism versus atheism versus pantheism. And we see that intersection in Acts 17 where Paul delivers a speech to the Athenian philosophers, and he quotes from their own sources to vindicate his claim that the living and true God exists. The first man in the island, Protos, for Publius of Malta. The title Protos for the chief official of Malta, ascribed to Publius, aligns with the historical usage. That is in Acts 28, verse 7. What about the Gospels themselves? I'm not going to go into detail here because as we look at the Gospels and as we slowly go through them in the harmony, we're going to see over and over and over again this sort of confirmation. But just to give you a taste, Herod's rule and construction of projects, Pontius Pilate's governorship and so forth, the Pilate Stone, Matthew talks about this. And really, you say, well, where does Matthew talk about this? Well, when the disciples are oohing and awing over the temple, that text is giving testimony to the great construction projects that Herod engaged in years before Christ was born. Jewish burial customs, the Galilean geography, and the fishing practices, those are spoken of in Mark, and they've been confirmed through archaeological research and other sources. Luke, Licinius, as Tetrarch of Abilene, that is the correct Roman official, and also the census practices found in Luke. Many people thought it was absurd to think that Joseph and Mary would have to travel to Bethlehem to be counted. And that was one of the main reasons why critics rejected the Lucan story. And then we found an Egyptian description, it was an archaeological find of a manuscript that described this very practice. In 100 AD, people had to travel to their hometowns to be counted for a census. The Pool of Bethesda with the 5 porticos in John 5:2, and the pool of Siloam, and crucifixion methods, and ossuaries, and so forth in Jerusalem. That is all discussed in John, and that has all been confirmed archaeologically. In fact, I told you last week that uh, the John Rylands papyrus, that is our oldest manuscript of the Gospel of John, forced critics to date John much earlier than they had been dating it. Along with that, we started discovering things. In the late 19th century, we discovered the Pool of Siloam. People thought that was just fiction. And John describes it very interestingly. He says, there is in Jerusalem a pool. Now, what does that imply about when John was written? In the year 70, the Jerusalem temple, along with Jerusalem itself, was utterly destroyed. So if he's saying there is in Jerusalem, he's describing present day events from his point of view. That means that the pool was still standing when John was writing. And that would move the Gospel of John before the year 70. Now, let me also tell you that critics have responded to that sort of argument. They have said, well, John was using what we call the historical present in Greek. And incidentally, that's true. All through John, if you begin studying Koine Greek, I can almost guarantee that your Greek professor is going to have you go into the book of John first. It's very easy Greek. And John loves to write in the present tense. My professor, Dan Wallace, did a study of this where he analyzed every single historic present in Greek literature from 300 BC, I believe his date ranges from 300 BC to AD 300. And so a 600-year period of the usages of the historical present in Greek. None of them described things. They all described events. And so that would indicate that if John 5:2 is an example of an historical present, it is the only one of its kind. What is the probability of that? I would say it's very low. And therefore, that fact alone indicates that John is not trying to write in the historical present as if these things are currently happening right now. The reason an author would do something like that is because they're trying to give you sort of a vivid picture. John is going to Jerusalem. Jesus is going to Bethesda, and so you're kind of with him in the journey, and that's a really good storytelling technique. But if John is not doing that thing here in John 5:2, then that means he is writing at a time when this pool is still in existence. It's not been destroyed by the Romans. And so this is one of the reasons, it's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons why I put John before the year 70. These are some sources for the archaeological confirmation of the book of Acts. Some books that might stand out for you. Craig Evans's work is always really good. John McCrae is good. Paul Mayer. F.F. Bruce, if you don't have the book, The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable? It is a classic on the study of the New Testament reliability. It's dated, but it's one of those books you just need to have because it's such a classic work, and I just highly recommend it. William Ramsey, Was Christ Born in Bethlehem? You'll see me citing that work some as we look at the birth narratives. So those are some ones that stand out in this list that I'm giving you. You will be able to get all of these slides eventually, at least, so you don't have to make sure you copy them all down right now. So are there any questions about this before we take another turn? Now, when was Acts written, and why is that important? That's the first question. At this point in our discussion, we're assuming, because I think we've established that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote these, and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are not just euphemisms for we don't know who these people are, and we're just going to follow the tradition. We've made the case that Matthew, the tax collector, an eyewitness to Jesus' life, wrote this. Mark, a student of Peter, wrote this. Luke, a companion of Paul, wrote this. And John, one of the disciples, wrote the gospel according to John. So when was Acts written? That's a really good question. Why does this matter? I'm going to answer the second question first. So, why does it matter if we know when Acts was written? The dating of the book of Acts significantly impacts our understanding of the following: the reliability of the document. The closer to the time, the closer that the writing is to the event itself, the more the chances are increased that it can be trusted. It helps us understand the development of early Christianity. It also helps us confirm the reliability of the gospel accounts themselves, because if Acts was written before the year 70, then that means all of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were written before the year 72. Not the year 72, but the year 70 also. And finally, the relationship between Acts and Luke's gospel and Paul's epistles, that all has a different spin on it if you have an early document that is confirmed and so forth, than if it's some late second century document, as some critics will contend. So these are some of the reasons why this is important. And these are the reasons why I think Acts was written before the year 70 and even before the year 62. Now, what happened in 70? Again, the temple was destroyed. Jerusalem was destroyed. This is one of the most significant events in human history. It has so many ramifications for what's going on today. Right now, there is a Middle East crisis, and it's been going on since really World War I. Why? Much of it is because of what happened to the Jews in the year 70 and in the year 135, when the Romans cast out the Jews, salted their lands, and renamed the land Palestine, the land of the Philistines. So it's been going on ever since. So this is a tremendously significant event. This is also a significant event for Christianity, because Jesus, according to the Gospels, predicted the destruction of Jerusalem. That prediction is never confirmed in Acts. Acts never discusses it. Now, some of you might say, well, why would Acts discuss it? Luke was in the habit of confirming prophecy. So just to give you one example, John the Baptist prophesies about our Lord that he will baptize in the Holy Spirit. Acts confirms that. So we would expect Acts to discuss the destruction of Jerusalem, but he doesn't. Now, some critics will say, well, that's because Luke was planning on a third volume. Possible, but it's unlikely. And why is that unlikely? Because of the way Acts ends. And Acts ends in chapter 28 with Paul still in prison. It's an abrupt ending with no real chance of a conclusion. Read how Luke ends and read how Acts ends, and the idea of a third volume of Luke just begins to be extremely unlikely. Plus, that is far more speculative than this. We would expect Luke to confirm the prophecy of our Lord, and it's not confirmed. So why is that? I think it's likely that he didn't write about it because he didn't know about it. He wrote before Acts. He wrote before Jerusalem was destroyed. There's no mention of James, Peter, and Paul. These are the three chief characters of Acts, and their deaths are never mentioned. It's highly likely that Peter and Paul died in the year 67, somewhere between 64 and 67, but really likely 67. And we know that James died in the year 62. Now, Luke does record the deaths of some minor characters in his book. Stephen is not a major character. So space is devoted to him because he is the first martyr, but he is not a person around whom a narrative is built. He records his death. James, an apostle, his death is recorded in Acts. So if these minor characters in Acts, they may be major characters in church history, but they're minor in terms of character development in Acts. If their deaths are recorded, wouldn't you think that Peter and Paul and James, their deaths would be recorded if, in fact, Luke was writing after their deaths. We also find no mention of the persecution of the church or the burning of Rome. This is a major event as well, almost as important as the destruction of Jerusalem, at least for Christians, because it was that fire in Rome that instigated the very first empire-wide persecution of Christians. That's never mentioned in Acts. The positive betrayal of Roman authorities. Luke doesn't say a whole lot of bad things about Romans, and often he says quite nice things about Roman authorities. Is he going to really do that if he's writing in the wake of a major persecution of Christians? A primitive church structure, no mention of bishops, for example, in Acts. Acts, despite the fact that it criticizes Jews here and there, nevertheless carries with it some an optimistic point of view with respect to Jewish church or Jewish Christian relationships. There's still a hope in the narrative that Jews and Christians can reconcile. There's an absence of later theological developments. What do I think Acts is? I think Acts is mainly written as a legal defense of Paul as he's about to go on trial. That would explain the abrupt ending, and that would explain the earliness of the work. He's writing this to present to the authorities as an indication of what Paul's saying is a vindication of what Paul is saying. This is proof that Paul is innocent of any crime. And apparently it worked because, according to tradition, Paul does get out of prison and he's able to minister for quite a few more years. So, Acts is early. Acts is written before the year 62. What about the Gospels? If you would turn with me to 2 Corinthians 8:18. Starting in verse 16, Paul says, "But thanks be to God, which put the same earnest care into the heart of Titus for you. For indeed he accepted the exhortation, but being more forward of his own accord, he went unto you. And we have sent with him the brother, whose praise is in the gospel throughout all the churches." It's a very curious line. Paul mentions a brother whose praise is in the gospel and is throughout all the churches. Now, what brother might he be talking about, and why would this brother be praised in the things of the gospel throughout all the churches? Well, it isn't Titus. We know that because he's sent along with him. The early church argued, and they took it as a matter of course even, that this is Luke. In fact, I gave a quote in one of the earlier lectures of Ignatius, and he actually spoke of Luke as the one who is praised throughout all the churches because of the things of the gospel. Now, what could Luke have possibly done to make him be praised among the churches because of the things of the gospel? Yeah, he wrote a gospel. Now, when was 2 Corinthians written? No later than around the year 56. And this would put the writing of Luke earlier still. And if Luke is the third gospel, guess when the others are written? They are going to be written maybe as early as 50 or earlier. And so this is one good place you can go to show somebody from the universally accepted epistles of Paul that we have a good reason to think that Luke was written quite early. So we have Acts written before the year 62, and that would push Luke into the 50s anyway. And then we have this confirmation from Paul indicating that Luke was written around 55, or I would say around 53. I've already given you a reason to think that John was written before the year 70, and I'm going to put John somewhere around the year 68. So here's the timeline of the four Gospels according to yours truly. Proto-Matthew is written somewhere between the years 29 and 33. Jesus began to minister in the year 29, in October of 29, and he will die in the year 33. In this class, I'm going to give you evidence for that. I'm just making the assertion now. And then we have what is called Marcus. Marcus is just fancy for early Mark. And what that really consists of is the Passion narrative. Now, why would I put the Passion narrative as having been written around the year 35? Because the Passion narrative in Mark does not name the high priest. Now, a lot of modern people reading this would say, well, that's because Mark didn't know what he was talking about and didn't know who the high priest was. But there's a reason why you're not going to name the high priest. What if I said to all of you, the president said yesterday, and I began to talk, who am I talking about? I'm talking about Donald Trump. What if I say the president said last year? Who am I talking about? I'm talking about Joe Biden, all right? Now, if you write within a few years of a leader's demise or his exit from office, people know who you're talking about. You don't have to name the person. Matthew and Luke do name the high priest. That's because they're writing to an audience who might not necessarily know who this high priest is. Rudolf Pesch, a German scholar, argues for this very well. I'm getting this secondhand because I don't know German, but I've seen the summaries of his arguments, and they are very strong that the Passion narrative we find in Mark was actually constructed very early in church history. Now, Caiaphas leaves office. He actually dies, I believe, in 36. So the Passion narrative is going to be written somewhere between 35 and 40, at least within living memory of people who would know exactly who that priest was when Jesus was being tried. And so I'm going to put the Passion narrative around 35. And then Matthew wrote an edition of his gospel that combines what he's produced. We call it Marcus, but really Matthew is probably the one that wrote that very first Passion narrative. And he takes this saying source that he wrote during the life of Jesus. He takes the Passion narrative and he gives us the very first gospel. And that first edition, I believe, did not consist of any quotations from the Old Testament. So for example, if you read the birth stories in Matthew 1 and 2, the birth narrative rather, it reads very smoothly if you take the quotations of the Old Testament out. And so this early edition just had just the basic gospel story from birth to death and resurrection. But before Matthew fully finishes his gospel, or while he's still working on it, Peter will leave around the year 41 or 42, and he will go to Rome, and he will take this Passion narrative and the saying source, and he will preach in Rome. And Mark will jot it down. He will scribble it down as sermon notes on Peter's preaching. And that's going to happen around the year 45, the very same year that Matthew is giving his full gospel that is extremely well developed into 5 sections, presenting us with a very particular theology. It's clear that this is just what John wanted to write. But what is apparently going on is that after Peter dies and some other apostles die and John is still lingering, there's a rumor going around that John is never going to die. So some remaining apostles apparently encouraged John to write an appendix to his gospel. And so I believe that Jesus said, what is it if Peter says, well, what about him? What's going to happen to John? And Jesus says, what is it to you if he's here until I return? And John gives an explanatory gloss. He says, he did not say he was not going to die. He said, what is it to you? It's not your business what I'm going to do with John. So John was actually squelching the rumor that was around at that time that he was never going to die. So as the very last point that I want to make to all of you, I did think, well, maybe they want to know where I date all of these books. And so this is my timeline for all the books of the New Testament. So Jesus dies in the year 33. Paul will convert in the year 34. Then we have the Passion narrative first constructed around 35. Paul will visit Jerusalem for the very first time in 36. Matthew will write his second edition around the year 41. Peter will leave within a year of that to go to Rome. He's going to take that old Mark and Passion narrative, that saying source, and deliver his gospel. That gospel will probably be written in the year 45, the same year that Matthew is written. That is also the same year that I think James wrote his epistle. One of the reasons why we think that is that James is alluding to a famine that had broken out, and he's talking to the Christians about famine relief. He's saying if a person comes into your church and they're starving to death, Don't pat them on the back and say, hey, may it be well with you. Actually give them food. Help this person out. Then Galatians will be written in the year 49. First and Second Thessalonians, I believe, were written by Paul in the year 51. Luke will be written in 53. First Corinthians and Second Corinthians in 55 and 56. Romans in 57. Colossians, Philemon, and Ephesians are all written in the year 60. Acts and Philippians are written in the year 61. James dies in the year 62, which is probably the same year that Peter writes his first epistle. Hebrews, 1 Timothy, and Titus are all written in 65. 2 Peter and 2 Timothy are written just before Peter and Paul died. These are their last epistles they send out. Then John will write his first edition of his gospel in Ephesus in the year 68. Then Jerusalem is destroyed. The remaining books of the New Testament, Jude will be written around the year 75. John, his final edition in 85. 1 John in 90. 2nd and 3rd John in 95. And then the book of Revelation will be written in the year 96. So that is my own understanding of how the New Testament was put together, who wrote them, and so forth. I've not defended all of this to all of you, and I always feel self-conscious when I make assertions without defending it. But I at least wanted you to know where I stand on this, and we can talk about reasons later. I have about 2 minutes, maybe 3. I am preaching tonight at Northgate Presbyterian Church, for those of you that are interested. I'm going to be delivering a sermon.
Okay, there we go. So I'm trying to learn what is and isn't a logical argument.
Okay.
So for instance, in Ephesus, we all know there's very little, if any, Christian presence. In Revelation 2:5, it prophesies, the Lord says, if you don't repent, we will remove your lampstand. Could that be used as evidence that the Bible in and of itself is true, or is that just correlation?
I think it would be more of correlation. There was a Christian presence in Ephesus. When Paul gets there, there are people who are they're still holding on to John's teachings. And so one of the things that has to happen is people have to learn that John himself is not the Messiah, but Jesus is. And I think that a clue that John was written in Ephesus, and a piece of internal evidence, as John goes out of his way in his prologue to say, this John who was sent as a witness, he came as a witness to the light. He himself was not the light. Why is he going out of his way to say this? Because there were people who were saying he's the light and not Jesus. So I think that's why we have that. But I would see it more as correlation and not proof.